Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on counting unsheltered youth. I am Samantha Batko, Director of the Homelessness Research Institute at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'll be serving as your host today. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars focused on preparations for the unsheltered element of the 2015 point-in-time count coming up in January. Today's webinar is hosted by the Homelessness Research Institute at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. The Alliance is a nonpartisan, nonprofit dedicated to ending homelessness through research and education, better policy, and capacity building. The Alliance feels that the quality of point-in-time counts, including unsheltered counts, are vital to measuring progress in efforts to end homelessness, which is why we are hosting this series this fall. Before we get to our first presentation, I wanted to remind everyone that all of the lines will be muted during the webinar. If you have questions at any point, you can send them to us through the webinar software. Please type them into the chat box labeled questions on your webinar control panel. We will have time at the end of the webinar to answer many of your questions. For those that we do not get to today, we will attempt to follow up after the webinar. Also, please note that a recording of this webinar will be posted on the Alliance's website, hopefully next week. Today's agenda. So we have a number of presenters today, and as I said, we'll be holding questions toward till the end of the webinar. So I will try to get through this as quickly as we can and get to all of your questions. We will start with William Snow from HUD, who will talk about the unsheltered point-in-time guidance and standards. We'll pass it to Coco Arswald, who will discuss California's Hidden in Plain Sight initiative. And then we'll follow with two community examples, one from Santa Clara County with Lynn Morrison and one from Sonoma County with Jenny Abramson. With that, I will pass it to William Snow to discuss the unsheltered point-in-time guidance and standards. William?
All right. Thank you, Samantha. And I want to thank the National Alliance for hosting this. We certainly feel strongly that the point-in-time count is a really critical thing to discuss. And, you know, we just released our point-in-time count methodology guide, so this is very important to us at this particular moment. I want to spend just a few minutes today talking about some of the groundwork. What are the requirements? What are the minimum standards? And what are the requirements that HUD has relative to youth? Or what are the suggestions and best practices we're seeing? And I'm excited to listen later in the presentation to more from communities. So I'm going to go over the evolution of the point-in-time count, just a little bit of information that I think is relevant to our discussion today. We'll also discuss the new point-in-time count methodology standards. We'll highlight some of the youth-related pieces of that guidance, and I'll talk about where we are right now in the point-in-time count standards as it relates to youth. So the evolution of HUD's expectations, or the PIT counts. For years, we've been doing the counts. Many of you have likely participated in that. I hope so. There have been two really important parts of how that has evolved over time. And I'd say the first part is the scope, and that it relates to what elements do we collect in the point-in-time count. That includes things like, do we count total persons? Are we also including subpopulation information? So I'm sure many of you have seen that we have definitely expanded that over time, and we collect information on now the demographics of individuals. We make the subpopulation mandatory. These are all really important things. We've also evolved in how accurate the counts are, and we focused our efforts on trying to make sure the counts are as accurate as possible, that we can feel like the counts are reliable, especially as we use them to track trends towards progress on national goals. And we've definitely seen that as we've gotten closer to ending veteran homelessness, and as youth becomes a much more big topic. As we get closer to 2020, we also expect our data to become more important on the youth arena, and we're excited about that. So one of the things we always struggle to balance is how much information can we get, how much accuracy can we demand, while there are practical limitations of doing a point-in-time count. It's something we struggle with. Every year we evaluate what things are being asked, what things do we need to collect on, and it's always something difficult because we know getting this data within the time frame we're talking about is not easy. And I want to give a special thanks to all of you and those who do the point-in-time counts. That's something, again, I love the data. It's something that's very close to me, and I work every year. I get involved with local counts, and I'm certainly involved on the standards, and we know it's difficult. So we always find that juggling act when we do standards or when we think about what elements we should collect. So to improve the accuracy aspect of the count, how confident we are in it, we released the updated point-in-time count methodology guide. And that guide shifts us from a world of suggestions, which is where our guidance previously really was. It was best practices and suggestions to an expectation of standards, things that communities must do in order to fulfill the point-in-time count. And that's something, again, I'm very excited about. I think it'll help us feel more confident in the data. And hopefully it's not meant to scare folks who are doing the count. A lot of it is stuff based on the law, and so it shouldn't be very new. It also will bring clarity. We have tons of questions we get every year about what's an acceptable methodology, what can we do, what should we not do. And those are the things we wanted to address in the guidance, and hopefully we've been able to do that. So given that the topic today is unsheltered point-in-time counts for youth, I'm going to focus on the unsheltered part of the guide, but I did want to put what each chapter was about so you can kind of see in a brief summary what's in it. The introduction goes over the 14 standards and also lays out the legal requirements that support the point-in-time count. We also have Chapter 2, which discusses point-in-time count methodology. Chapter 3 goes into planning your count. Chapters 4 and 5 talk about the sheltered and unsheltered aspect of implementing the count, and Chapter 6 discusses the steps taken after the point-in-time count. So let's go into, again, just the unsheltered standards, and there are just a few things I want to highlight for us all to see. Standard number 1 is that CoCs are responsible for planning, conducting at least biennially, which is every other year, a point-in-time count of homeless persons within the geographic area that meets HUD's requirements. So I focus here on who's responsible. The CoCs are responsible. How often does it have to be done? Well, we would hope that everybody would do a full count every year. That a full count is a sheltered and unsheltered. But by law, we don't require everybody to do that unsheltered count every year. And so we realize that's, again, a practical limit for several areas that they just can't do it. And we recognize that. We know we're already pushing the limits to some extent on what we're asking you to collect. So we're not, at this point, asking for a required unsheltered count every year. So Standard 11 goes over the definition. This is the one I think is most important for our conversation today as it relates to youth. We often get the comment that the point-in-time count data doesn't reflect the homeless youth population. And it's certainly hard to say it doesn't. I mean, we look at those numbers. We see last year the number was 46,000 unaccompanied homeless youth up to age 24. And any persons in the homeless youth arena knows that there's got to be more than that. So it's important to focus on a few things. First, we recognize we likely haven't covered everybody. And that's partly why this guidance hopefully will provide some more basis for getting a better count. But we also need to know the limits of the definition for the count. We have a statutory limit that states that HUD is only allowed to require CoCs to count persons who are unsheltered and sheltered. And that, again, becomes tricky because if a youth is doubled up the night of the count, where do they fall? Technically, they don't meet the definition for the point-in-time count. And so this is an area where we've stressed, again, in the guide and elsewhere, that the point-in-time count data is a good baseline for counting unaccompanied youth, but it certainly isn't the only place to get that data. And we encourage you to find other ways to count youth that will represent this group that's not counted or represent kind of the flow of youth in the homeless system. So this is a really key standard which defines a lot about what our data actually represents. Standard number 9 just goes over some of the methodologies that are acceptable. I definitely refer you to the guide on this. We have a lot more information about what's acceptable for counting methodologies. And it is best, again, just to reference that the written guidance that's found online. And there's one final standard. We recognize that there are some areas where point-in-time counts are conducted, but there's never a person found. The most common is the extreme parts of deserts or gated communities. And so we're giving COCs an allowance to exclude those areas from the count if they have some documentation showing that they've tried to count there and there have been no homeless persons identified. So this is just a practical reality that, you know, there's sometimes when you don't need to go count because they're not there and you know it. All right. So that's our guidance. I want to move on and talk about youth and how that relates to the new guidance. That's been a fun piece for us. I think many of you know, especially those who are really keyed into the youth community, know that in 2013 we did a point-in-time count initiative called Youth Count. And in that, 9 communities participated in kind of a pilot. During their count, they were willing to show us what they did to get the most effective point-in-time counts. And we asked the Urban Institute to do a process study to help us understand the best practices that we could share with other communities. And we tried to get a good scope of urban versus rural versus east versus west, all the various factors or some of the major factors that come into play when we're talking about counting. And so we documented that. If you've read the Youth Count study, you'll notice that a lot of what's in our point-in-time count methodology guidance reflects what is there. The part that perhaps is most beefed up in the guidance is the fact that youth providers, youth stakeholders need to be at the table from the get-go. So our planning chapter, chapter 3, talks a lot about the importance of having youth providers at the table. And so we tried to be very cognizant of making sure they are constantly recognized and that they're not intended to be part of the count at the last minute, but really from the get-go. That's important to us. We've also known that some of the difficulties communities have had with counting youth have been in just recognizing the barriers to counting youth, right? The conflicting youth definitions, the fact that youth are not adults, and so they may be in different places. Youth don't want to be found. I mean, there are some very good reasons they don't want to be found, and they just don't. And some youth, they just don't consider themselves homeless. And that may be true of the adult community to some extent, but it's certainly prevalent in the youth community. And so our hope with the guidance was to help people be aware that these issues are there and they need to try to find a way to address them. So we provided several suggestions about how to improve the quality of the youth aspect of the counts, particularly with unsheltered youth. Again, most of this, if not all of it, is in the Urban Institute study, but I'll just kind of go through the list there. We encourage collaborating with local school district homeless liaisons. More and more, we're finding liaisons who are willing to participate. They have a tough job. They're very busy, but they know a lot. And we don't want that resource to get wasted. And so we're encouraging access to and participation with the homeless school liaisons. Recruiting currently or formerly homeless youth to assist with the count, that is so, so critical. That could be at any phase. That's in the planning process and trying to find where youth are. That could be in the actual count. It's just, there are so many ways that current or formerly homeless youth help us that are really important to us. Looks like presentation is coming off and on. I apologize for that.
No, William, we got stuck on one of your slides, so I went ahead and switched it to me. I have your the proper slide up now.
Fantastic.
Sorry.
Nope, thank you very much. So we encourage engaging organizations serving homeless youth. As I mentioned before, we've encouraged that in the planning section. We encourage it everywhere. We want youth providers at the table. They're critical to finding the youth. In fact, it really is not possible to do a good job counting youth without them present. Certainly identifying locations where homeless youth congregate. We know that's different than where adults congregate. And so that's really important for planners to know. Holding magnet events, we found great success there. Seattle's a great example of that. Using social media to raise awareness and outreach. Our homeless youth are adept at the social media. And not only are we trying to use social media to attract more volunteers or more access to resources for homeless youth providers and services, but to find the youth themselves. They know how to use that media, and they're on it. So identify a lead homeless youth pick count coordinator has been critical in many areas, providing services, food, and incentives to youth being counted, and then survey locations during multiple times throughout the day we found is also really important. So we're going to go to the next slide, please, Sam. So what about the youth count as it relates to what's required now? So I'm putting up 2014. I really had hoped we were going to have the 2015 point in time count notice out. We have a few things that are stuck in clearance right now. So we're going to get that out as soon as possible. I'll highlight some of those things that I don't think will be controversial in terms of going out. We anticipate that they'll be approved, so I'll just raise some of them here. But in 14, as with 13 actually, we expanded the way we collected our household data so that we could get age information. And that's been really helpful for us to get a grip on the 18 to 24 category in particular. We really didn't know a lot about that group from a point in time standpoint. And now we have 2013 data, we have 2014 data, and we're looking forward to using that in the future to understand homeless trends with our youth population. In the household with only children category right now, we have it broken out by one-child households and multi-child households. That's a proxy for unaccompanied children. And that's been, it's not a perfect proxy, we'll be the first to admit it. In fact, for 2015, what we're hoping to do is just collect the total number of children under 18 in this household with only children category and add a new screen that's a subset of all of the household types that lets us see the nature of our unaccompanied children and youth. So we'll ask by age category, how many unaccompanied persons under the age of 18, how many between 18 and 24. We're also hoping to be able to ask questions about parenting youth. And that's been something a lot of questions have come up on, and we'd like to be able to address it. So if all goes well in 2015, that will be part of our standards. And actually, that's the core of our changes for 2015 that we're hoping to implement. So we're excited about that. We know, again, there's some limits to what we can ask communities to collect. We know we're kind of at that limit because it takes a lot to do a point-in-time count. But we also know that that youth data, we just need more. And so 2015, the largest change will be around getting better data for unaccompanied youth. And so we're very excited about that. Next slide, please. I just want to finish up by highlighting that there are some resources available, and we're excited about providing more resources. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end of all this, but it's good to note that we have the Ask a Question feature on the HUD Exchange, so you can use that as well if you have questions about counting unaccompanied youth or youth in general in the context of the PIC count. So again, I want to thank you all for being on the call today, and I'm going to turn it back to Samantha.
Thank you so much, William. And we're going to turn it over to our second panelist today, Coco Arswald, who's going to be talking about an initiative in California to count unaccompanied homeless youth.
Everyone hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Coco.
I'm thrilled to be part of this. Thank you. Sorry, I just couldn't see if my unmuted button had worked. So I'm really grateful to be able to share this information with all of you. And I want to, first of all, thank William and acknowledge that we're really in a period of a sea change in counting youth on the federal level. And the first big step was, of course, including unaccompanied minors as a subgroup. The second big step was to start counting transitional age youth, the 18 to 24-year-olds. And the third big step are some really important changes in the guidelines as reflected in William's presentation. And I think this really gives the opportunity for us nationally to have a baseline count that's real of youth. There are certainly challenges, as William mentioned, regarding having multiple definitions, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we proceed. So the We Count today is a collaboration between the California Homeless Youth Project, based in Sacramento and led by Shahara Hyatt, and the UC Berkeley School of Public Health, where I'm a faculty member. We also work very closely with our project coordinator, Jess Lynn, Laura Petrie, who is now in Los Angeles working on the count there, and Jessica Reed, who's been working with us most recently on We Count. And the whole initiative is supported by the California Wellness Foundation, which has a long time commitment to supporting initiatives to help homeless youth in California. Our first piece, that I'll talk to you about today, is the Hidden in Plain Sight assessment of the youth pit, and then I'll talk about what we did in response to this assessment. This assessment was conducted in order to assess what was going on with the youth pit in California and to describe the current approaches to counting unaccompanied youth. This was for the 2013 count, and to describe what the best practices and innovations were at that point, as well as describing barriers and recommendations. And in order to do this, we reviewed the formal data from CoC reports in 2011 and 2013, and also conducted interviews with 31 of the 42 CoCs, as well as active consulting groups. And in that work, we were this is the report that we published that you can find at the California Homeless Youth Project, and it has a lot of detailed information and appendices and tools that you can use in planning your count. So in looking at the numbers of the counts, we found that there is widespread undercounting of both minors and transitional aged youth. California that counted each of these numbers of homeless youth. So you can see here there were 16 CoCs in 2011 that reported having 0 unsheltered minors, and 17 CoCs in 2013 that reported 0 unsheltered minors. And similarly, 15 CoCs reported fewer than 10 minors, and 13 CoCs reported fewer than 10 minors in 2013. So clearly vast undercounting of unaccompanied minors, with the majority of CoCs reporting fewer than 10 unaccompanied minors, and little change from 2011 to 2013. There was an important change for the transition-aged youth, who are also vastly undercounted. So we can see that in 2011 and 2013, the majority of CoCs reported fewer than 100 transition-aged youth who were homeless in their jurisdictions. However, the big change was that the fact of requiring the implementation of accounts, there were no CoCs, or there was only one CoC that reported no count of transitional age youth in 2013. And this is looking at by region, so not by CoC, the numbers of both TAY represented in gold and minors represented in light blue that were counted in these various regions. And the good news is that in each region there was an increased count of TAY between 2011 increase count into increased numbers by so how did this happen, and find regarding the best methods for including more youth in the counts? And our overall goal in We Count is to improve youth inclusion in these counts. So what we found was that communities really range widely in their engagement in and use of youth-inclusive counting methods in the 2013 count, ranging from minimal changes where communities simply just reported the number of unaccompanied minor and TAY categories as required by HUD. However, some communities made changes in their planning processes similar to those that are being recommended now by HUD. And those including youth providers in the PIT count planning, so not just at the last minute, but including providers in the planning. Also collaborating with McKinney-Vento school liaisons, and there have been some really great model examples of this in California, notably in Santa Cruz. And also including youth in the PIT count planning. So once again, not just close to the count, but in advance because they are the experts. There also were changes to count methods in some communities, including youth service providers and youth themselves as enumerators, recognizing that you really need these individuals involved because they can identify other youth, and that it may be difficult for other people to be able to know who to approach. And also incentivizing youth participation, so paying young people to spend the time as advisors and as enumerators. In addition, other count methods that were changed and found to be successful were including youth-inclusive or youth-specific and flexible enumeration routes. So going to sites, as William mentioned as well, where it was known that youth would spend time, and having those routes be flexible day by day, because the sites where youth spend time change very regularly and much more quickly than those sites where adults spend time. So having the flexibility such that on the day of the count, a young person on the street might tell the counting team, gee, you know, there are some kids over there by the river today, or there's some people over there in the park by the Grove, and so that those critical. There is a strong tradition of conducting PIT counts very early in the morning for very good reasons in the adult population. However, this really undermines communities' abilities to find youth, and so conducting the count at times of day where youth could be found was a successful change in methods that communities employed. And then including youth-related survey questions in the PIT count was also an important way to make the count more relevant for youth, including asking youth whether they're in school, whether they've been in the foster care system, whether there's someone in their support network who can help them. And some of these questions can be predictive of what percent of the youth population is more likely to become long-term homeless. And then finally, a few communities implemented a lot of the changes and others and conducted really a dedicated youth-specific count as part of their counting process. So there were some important barriers, including the fact that youth can be hard to identify, as mentioned by William. And there are some subgroups that are more difficult to identify than others. Some youth are, you know, like the youth that we have in the Haight Street district, traveling type youth, that we have also in Berkeley, are, you know, pretty easy to identify. However, there are significant subgroups of youth who may not be as easy to identify, especially if people who are not part of those subgroups are counting them. And these subgroups include immigrant youth, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer and questioning youth, low-income African-American, Latino, Native American, and Asian and Pacific Islander youth also tend to not necessarily present as homeless, and so may not be as easy to identify. They may not also identify as homeless at all. Other challenges that communities reported was the limited integration of youth providers, either youth providers reporting that they were not included or they were included too late or too minimally to be able to affect the count, or some youth providers feeling that because PIT numbers don't reflect well their population, having limited engagement in state like California, where extreme conditions such as desert and mountain regions can really affect the ability to conduct a good count. Similarly, the weather conditions affected the count. And then there is certainly a feeling in mixed, rural, and frontier CoCs that the guidance that exists is easier to apply in rural areas. And so that was a barrier that was reported. There are also important methodological barriers. Wariness of quote-unquote statistical methods that were used people had some wariness because they felt that maybe some methods employed might not be accepted by HUD, or that their local community would look askance on those types of methods. There was also a concern about ability to compare results over time. So despite the fact that the count was really, not including youth, that if the methods were changed, that you would not be comparing apples to apples. I think if your numbers are poor to start with, it's much more important to have a good baseline count so that you can eventually compare real apples to real apples. And finally, communities reported inexperience with counting TAY or lack of people who could help them with this. There were some important structural barriers that communities reported, including lack of funding, limited provider capacity, concerns regarding reporting obligations. Do you have to report a young person who is homeless if they're a minor? And there are laws in California stating that you do not have to report a homeless minor, but those are important points to check in your local jurisdiction. And finally, conflicting definitions of homelessness as we've discussed already. So in response to this assessment, we have conducted a statewide technical assistance project to address some of the needs that CoCs expressed. And this has been in 3 phases, of which I will primarily discuss phase 1. So we have conducted technical assistance convenings for all CoCs, and we have also followed up with some seed grants and shared tools that I'll discuss more in a moment. And then we are going to be starting some one-on-one technical assistance for 2 CoCs very soon. And finally, structural interventions informed by study findings are an important ongoing part of the WeCount project, including working with HUD, policymakers, legislators, and others to decrease policy barriers, legal barriers, and perceptual barriers that affect youth inclusion in the count. So our first phase, the technical assistance convenings, took place from April to July of this year. These were really fun and incredibly successful. We met with representatives of CoCs, McKinney-Vento liaisons, and partnering youth agencies in the CoCs regionally. This map represents the different CoCs, color-coded by how they were grouped for our meetings. And we, in order to increase inclusion, particularly of youth providers, which those programs are pretty much uniformly struggling to even survive. We provided travel reimbursements and stipends so that they could attend and be part of the discussion. 32 of our 41 CoCs in California participated, and we had 118 participants in all our locations. We also started a Google group. We have now more than 75 members to date, and I have a link to that Google group to share resources at the end of the presentation, and if anyone would like to join, even if you're not from California, you're more than welcome to be part of our Google group. And the curriculum included team building and promoting relationships between and within CoCs, because we felt that not only getting dialogue within CoCs but across regions was really going to help people who are doing this on very limited resources to be effective. And so we had the CoC partners as well as runaway and homeless youth providers and McKinney-Vento liaisons work together to promote their discussion, and through tools and exercising for planning help them begin to plan their account. So we had them identify the strengths and weaknesses of their prior accounts and the opportunities and threats that presented themselves for the future count, so they could really figure out what their goals are for youth inclusive counting. We also had them think about social geography, that is to say identifying different subgroups of youth and where they might be mapped and which partners might be able to help them access those subgroups of youth, and then start to make a count timeline and plan. We also discussed how to identify engaged youth, best practice methods for counting youth, and really encouraging communities just to move forward on increasing youth inclusion, not expecting that all communities would do a committed youth count, knowing that that is a huge jump for especially low resource settings. And then we really supported communities or encouraged communities to enumerate using multiple definitions of youth, so that the definitions that apply for the County Office of Education could also be included, as well as the HUD definition, and then just being clear about the numbers in their reporting, as William mentioned. We did an evaluation of our process, and what we found, this is what communities told us, what was helpful. They really felt that it was very helpful to have a full spectrum of possibilities for youth inclusion and not be told one specific way to count. And I think the menu of options that have been shared by William and by some of the resources help communities pick what's going to work for them to at least increase inclusion. Providing a space for networking and collaboration, I think, was probably the biggest accomplishment of our convenings, and providing, once again, a space for dialogue. And then the seed grants also, which I'll discuss in a moment, is based on the training, which is really exciting, including planning and collaborations earlier, engaging youth with the planning, hiring youth enumerators, conducting magnet events, integrating the McKinney-Vento data with the PIT, so when they create the report, having the data be alongside it, so that in the media and in community discussions, those numbers aren't pitted against each other, but they're clearly presented so people understand why they're different. Some communities are planning to conduct a separate count, and they are also planning to adapt survey tools. People did feel like there was some information overload in this training, which was less than a day long and suggested a 2-day training, and there was some scheduling difficulty getting everyone together, especially given the distances in California. So the seed grants have just been awarded, and those seed grants are for $2,500 to communities to increase youth inclusion in their count. And so we're really excited that these 23 communities will be using this money to pay for youth advisory boards, to have stipends for youth enumerators, reimburse youth for participating in surveys, use it to do advertising of counts across their communities to increase inclusion, or maybe to do magnet events, or maybe use technology for the data. We're also about to release the survey tool that we're going to suggest as a standard survey tool in California. And we're hoping to work on having maybe some kind of phone-based version of it. And we're hoping this one can also be compatible with the HMIS and RIMUS data. And phase 2, just briefly, we are going to be providing intensive technical assistance to 2 low-resource communities for the upcoming count to support their local capacity, but also to use them as model communities, demonstration communities, to share with the larger state. And those have just been picked. We're really excited that Kings Tulare County as well as Yolo counties will be our 2 one-on-one technical assistance sites. So I really appreciate, once again, the chance to share our project with all of you. This is the information to get the Hidden in Plain Sight report, and also take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Coco. And so that everyone knows, we'll make Coco's presentation available on our website along with all the other presentations from today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Lynn Morrison from the Bill Wilson Center, who is going to be presenting on their efforts in Santa Clara County. Lynn?
Thank you. Let me get this set up here, and
looks great.
Okay, we're good to go. So I'm Lynn Morrison. I'm with the Bill Wilson Center, and we're in Santa Clara County. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, and my slides won't go when I press this. Why is that? You may need to do it there, Sam. I can't make mine. Can you control it, Sam? Oh, there we go. Okay. So talk a little bit about what we did in Santa Clara County. First of all, Santa Clara County has approximately 1.7 million people in it, and it's mostly an urban county except for the southern part of the county, which is more rural. And we did the count mostly concentrating on the urban area, and then in the rural area we did concentrate on a couple of the towns that are down there. So that's Santa Clara County in the middle of California. Bill Wilson Center, we are the kind of the primary youth provider for youth services, and so we have taken a lead and done the count since 2009 and working with the city of San Jose and various other partners. So I'm going to go through the planning process, the implementation, the methodology, how we trained the youth and deployed the youth, and then also just a few of the lessons that we learned from this process. Planning, I think as everybody's talked about, it's important to start pretty early, and so we took the lead in the last count on the 2013, and actually we went out and identified agencies and city and county departments, youth advocates, county office of education, and then Applied Survey Research, which has been the agency that contracted to do the count for the last number of years, and so they're experts on this and been amazing in terms of helping us out with the youth count. And we, like I said, took the lead. Normally it seems like in our county everything starts to kind of ramp up around December, but we decided that we would convene people earlier than that, and actually in late September we facilitated our first meeting to kind of talk with people and get commitments from different people on what role they would take. A number of the people that came to the first meeting kind of thought, didn't really involve them and didn't know what they would do. So it was really a planning process to see who we could get on board and who could make a commitment to doing it. And then over the next few months we held other meetings to look at kind of the logistics of how the count would happen, what survey questions. And we actually found in terms of the survey questions that these meetings leading up to the count were really valuable for us to look at what kinds of information do we want to get out of this as a service provider agency, and we're able to look at some of the questions and see how we could get some more information that would help us. And then as we went along, we developed a core group that implemented the count. Along with the overarching planning, we were also doing some youth planning. And again, as we've talked about, it's important to bring the youth on as early as possible and to have them involved in all aspects of the planning process. So the youth that we have used over time and that we did this time were also homeless youth that are getting services at our drop-in center. And we have, 40 to 50 youth coming into our drop-in center every day. And we had the staff there working with the youth who knew the youth, holding focus groups and identifying youth who were leaders and then approaching them to see whether they would be willing to be a part of this, and also talking with them about the whole process and what it would look like and how they saw it working. So that was a part of the whole process of going forward. A major piece also was having the youth identify the hot spots. We didn't do like the overall count does, like a section by section and hits every street and place in the county. We mostly focused on places that the youth identified as hotspots where they knew other youth would be hanging out. So downtown San Jose is probably the main area. There were encampments, malls, abandoned houses, places that homeless youth were most likely to be found based on the experience of other homeless youth. And like I think has been mentioned before, the youth, many of them try to remain invisible, and so it was really important to get the homeless youth and get their expertise in how we can find these youth. The implementation, the regular count, as others have mentioned, takes place at the crack of dawn, and most youth are not up at the crack of dawn and are not in the same places that adult homeless are congregating. So we looked at doing it. We did it between 3 and 7 p.m. on the same day as the regular count on the January 29th and January 30th, and we focused on 3 to 7 as a time when youth are more visible, they're out and about, and this was again done on the recommendation of the homeless youth that were working on the count. Afterwards, we talked with some of the youth, and there was some thought that we should have also maybe split up, and in some areas maybe being out later at night would be effective, 10, 11, 12 o'clock, midnight, that there's some areas that might have also been a good time to be doing the count. So stuff to take into account for the next one. And again, the focus was on the specific sites that were identified, and rather than covering all of the census tracts. And the homeless youth were the enumerators. It was important that we identified the youth, and then it was important to provide obviously training for how to do the enumeration. And so the applied survey research staff provided an orientation and training on the day that we were doing the count, and talked about how to fill out the enumeration forms, protocols on how to count, not approaching or engaging individuals, and also safety issues, making sure that they were safe out there and didn't feel threatened in any way. And then it was also important in terms of the count to be able to categorize them as under 18 or between the ages of 18 and 24. Once they went through the training process, they were deployed from our drop-in center. They went out in teams of 2, and the staff drove the youth to the sites that they had identified, the streets and the malls and the encampments. And this is all up Santa Clara County, so it was within the cities, and then it was also in South County at two of the cities or towns that were in South County. And then for some of the areas, the youth walked the downtown areas, rode the bus routes. There's one main bus route that goes all pretty much from one side of the county to the other side of the county, and the youth rode those buses and talked with counted kids along the bus route. The deployment site, like I said, was at our drop-in center, which made it pretty easy that it was all localized, and all the teams left from there and then returned there after the count so that we could keep track of what was going on. So the lessons learned, I think, from this is that it's important, obviously, to involve the youth from the beginning in planning and implementing the count. It's also important after the count. We held a focus group to find out what types of things worked, what types of things didn't work, what things would they change based on their experience, and got some really good feedback. I think one of the biggest things was about the survey, because we also had the youth do the survey at later dates. And I think important information, it was way too long because we had the youth piece and then the general piece, and so it took way too long for the youth to fill it out. So looking back at how can we make that more streamlined so that it's easier for the youth to do. And then they also talked about maybe doing different times. So I think we got some good information from the youth on what worked and what didn't work and how we can improve things going forward. I think another big piece, and this has also been talked about, is financial incentives for the participants. They were paid $10 an hour for all the hours they worked, which included attending the trainings, doing the actual enumeration. We also obviously provided food, fed them every time that we had meetings, which is also, I think, a good incentive for all of us. And then the other thing is that we really set high expectations of the youth. We looked at it as a job. This is a job, and they were expected to act accordingly. We also used it as, you know, you show up on time, you follow through, you do all those kinds of things. It becomes a part of your resume. We become references in jobs. So I think it was treating it seriously, and then the youth treated it seriously, which I think was also a very important piece of it. And then last, I think recognizing the limitations of the model may not be as effective in more rural areas. And the piece that we're still working on, I think, is looking at how we can get the school data in this so that we can get a better count going forward. So that is the end of my slides. Thank you very much, and I'll send it back to you, Sam.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to our final presenter, Jenny Abramson, and she is going to present on efforts in Sonoma County with our second community example. Jenny?
Hi, let's see. I just want to get this to a slideshow. Do you see it yet? There.
Yep.
There you go.
Great. I didn't have my name on here because I was going to present this with a colleague who has been really our lead on the youth count in Sonoma County, but she couldn't make it when we rescheduled the time. In any case, here I am talking about a more rural area. Much of what I have to say is similar to what Lynn said, but we are operating in a community that's quite large, small in population, about 500,000 people, but over 1,500 square miles. We're about an hour north of San Francisco. We have 9 cities in the county. Some are as small as 7,000 residents. The largest is the county seat, which has 170,000 residents. But for the purpose of this discussion, it's really a huge area. About 95% of our territory is rural or made up of tiny little towns. And the vast majority of the terrain is agricultural, parks, or wilderness. Some of it's very remote. It's also very popular as a tourist destination. Therefore, we have an extremely high housing cost and also minimal public transportation, and this has led to some of the highest rates of homelessness that we've been able to find. We have this freeway, the 101 freeway, that runs all the way from San Diego and through Lynn's community and all the way north to Oregon. It's a regular pathway for youth who are traveling, as well as for drugs and sex traffickers. And that brings us to another big issue in our community, because the grow industry in Northern California creates certain dangers in what you would think is a really safe rural area. It's a small community where there have been homicides from drug deals that went bad that have had huge ripple effects. And we have areas of the county that we don't even go dare count, you know. They go there to count unless we have people from inside that industry because of the illegal industry. So the challenges in counting both in general and the youth certainly has to do with the huge territory. Some of the terrain is very difficult and mountainous. And also here, more than 3/4 of the homeless population is living outside. The youth are particularly hidden. They're living deeply hidden in parks, in creek areas, in abandoned buildings. We have very few housing resources for youth, just a 6-bed teen shelter and a new 7-bed shelter for foster youth returning. There was great concern for the youth who were traveling up and down the 101 freeway. And we've also learned that a lot of the youth hang out when they can, they get to the smaller communities where they can hide from the more dangerous things that are going on with gangs and sex trafficking in particular. But being in a small community, at least in terms of numbers, means that we also have strong relationships and a lot of trust. We have at least one very strong youth service agency, agencies with a long history in our community. We build good relationships, and they have really great street knowledge. Now we have more of a history of youth-run programs. We have a foster youth day center in Santa Rosa that's completely run by the youth, and it's right in the center of town, and it's become our main deployment center. And there's a general willingness to trust the subject population to invest in and tell their own story. And lastly, the youth agencies where people have been working for a very long time, of course, have this knowledge of what homeless youth are doing during their day and where they hang out, very similar to what Lynn talked about. Similarly, we have worked to engage homeless youth right from the beginning. We would hold a planning session with county maps, and we asked them not just where they'd go, where they live, but where they used to live. And they would identify these far-flung communities 20, 30 miles from each other and where to go there. So we would outline all of this on the map. And then they did choose to go out in after-school hours because that's when they would find people. Once we had done this, kind of outlined all the routes that we would like to go to in 3 to 5 primary communities, typically we would have them negotiate with the overall count leadership for the resources they needed. They needed, in addition to the minimum 2 youth per team who were paid, and sometimes more people, they needed transportation to get there. So we would make that work as well. And the youth suggested what roles adults could take to support them, particularly as drivers. We would find drivers during the general count who just couldn't stand not to do more. They identified the after-school hours, as I mentioned. They were paid hourly to canvass hours that they had identified, including, of course, for training before. We would focus on known gathering places, and then, of course, they marked up a tally sheet. One thing I was thinking about when I was listening to Lynn, because we're so spread out, we've been trying to establish more than one deployment site. So, for example, one in Santa Rosa and one in Petaluma, which is a good 20 miles away, both of them general centers for homeless youth. Lastly here, I think we also do our count in 2 phases, and that really makes a difference when you're covering a giant territory. We have our surveys conducted by the peers only, by the youth only, and we've seen that only a tiny fraction of the youth that we found were found in the general count that we would do early morning as well. And that tiny group is so much within the margin of error when we understand that whatever we're doing, it's an undercount. We figure it's still within the margin of error. Let's see, is there anything else? I'm looking at the notes I had. The buy-in by the homeless youth has allowed us to add additional questions. We've learned a lot about what the youth's needs are that we didn't know before. We've documented the role of family violence in youth becoming homeless. We've been able to learn that many of the youth we work with feel safer homeless than they did when they were housed with their families. And then I should say that before 2009, we were never able to count more than 15 youth. We were one of those communities that had very, very few on CoCs chart. But we'd been hearing numbers like 1,000 youth for years, and our community didn't feel like they could trust the count we were doing. So we, too, contracted with Applied Survey Research to improve the quality of our counts in general, and the youth count was a very big part of that. So in 2009, we counted 92 youth for the first time. That was the youth under the age of 18. And we also counted transition-age youth that year, but since the definition and the age range hadn't yet been established, we're not comparing it. By 2011, nationwide, we had settled on the 18 to 24-year-old range, so we have comparative numbers since then. And in 2013, we were following the new guidance, and we asked survey questions about the ages of people who were living in cars and tents and vans and places that we couldn't see inside during the general count. So this helped us record a far more accurate picture of homelessness among transition-age youth than we'd ever been able to do. So some people are marketing this as growth in the homeless youth population, but it's really just better methodology. And the last slide here is just how to reach me if you have further questions. And Lisa is the person who was going to do this with me, who is really quite an expert on homeless youth, and I know is also available to help people. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions now. And I will be reading the questions that are sent in, that have been sent in to us from the dashboard that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you do have questions at this time for any of our presenters, feel free to send them in to the chat box that is on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side of your screen, most likely. And so the first question that we have is for William. And William, the question is, since the the unsheltered counts are not required every single year, do you know what percentage of continuums of care do an unsheltered count regardless?
Yeah, very good question. So historically, it's been about 2/3 of the CoCs, so around 66, 67%. In 2014, we actually had right around 80% of the CoCs, and so we were excited to see the growth there.
Fantastic, thanks. And then I think that this question came in during William's presentation, but I believe that there's probably a couple of other presenters who can talk a little bit about this too. But we got a lot of questions about, can you talk a little bit more about how continuums can work with the schools and with their liaisons, specifically how you can possibly collect data from the schools even if it doesn't go into the data that's reported to HUD, and also if any of the, if Coco, Lynn, or Jenny, any of you have conducted your surveys in the schools, even if it's separate from your point-in-time count. So William, do you want to go ahead and go first and talk about that from a HUD perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough question, one that we've been grappling with for a long time. And the question is really how much confidence can we have in that data on the night of the count, right? A lot of it's collected in October, September, October, when the school season starts. One strategy we've seen that we feel is positive but is very intensive, resource intensive, is when the school liaisons are able to take the data that they have and contact the homeless youth that they're aware of from the beginning of the school year and try to get a hold of them to see where they are on the night of the count. Again, we recognize that is a huge lift. We would love to see that because it's a great practice, but difficult. But yeah, we certainly have been thinking about it and love to see more best practices or promising practices in that arena.
And Jenny, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of doing work with the schools in rural areas?
Well, yeah, the thing that we've been up against is the fact that as a rural heritage area, we have 43 school districts in our county. And some of them have 2 schools in them. That's it. Therefore, even we have a great relationship with the Office of Education, but they are having great difficulty even working with their own data. So, you know, we're just kind of working our way through it, and maybe we can use their data this year, but I don't know how much.
And then, Coco, from a statewide perspective, can you talk a little bit about how some of the communities in California have been able to work with their school districts and maybe how some of them have had more challenges? Coco? Okay, maybe we'll circle back to her and see if...
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. I'm back. Sorry. So some of what Jenny talked about having multiple school districts within one COC is a big challenge for communities. There have definitely had communities that have, you know, 60. I think models in California and outside of California that can be used. Applied Survey Research did do a model program with Santa Cruz County and with a really fabulous, highly motivated McKinney-Vento liaison there. And what they did, because that list is very long, like William said, of who is homeless in a county, you know, in the fall prior to the count, because that's really prohibitive. They did not attempt to contact all those children or all their families. What they did was really focus on the youth who were homeless in categories that fit the HUD definition. And although that's not required in the McKinney-Vento count, is my understanding anymore, most jurisdictions are still categorizing youth by their type of homelessness. And so the literally homeless category is the category where they've been going back to those families either by phone or in other ways to verify the child's homelessness. In Nevada, what they did was something similar, but because they have one school district, even though it's a huge region in southern Nevada, they were able to work with liaisons in all the schools and contact youth in class to find out what their status was the night before, and were able to conduct the count that way. So I think there are ways of doing this such that there won't be duplication. If you're counting in cars, for instance, if a young person says they were in a car the night before, then they didn't include those young people in Nevada. So you can think about how to do it in a way that you can add.
Great. Thank you, Coco. And then, William, I think this is probably for you. Is there anything prohibiting continuums of care from doing a youth count in or on school premises?
It's a good question. It's actually it's one that we are unable to answer from the national perspective, because all the rules that apply to access to the premises have to do with local requirements. I am not aware of any restrictions on going onto actual premises, the campuses. The bigger concern is whether or not a consent has been given by the youth or the family with youth to provide that data, and that is something where we would encourage you to work with the liaison. We know that there have been some fantastic work by the McKinney-Vento liaisons in various areas to ensure that the consent is such that it would allow them to recontact them or find access to them in other times beyond their initial engagement, and use the data for things like the point-in-time count.
Okay, great. Jenny, this question is specifically for you. What types of incentives did you give youth?
What incentives did we give youth?
Mm-hmm.
They, too, were paid hourly when they went out to canvass, and also by the survey when they went out to survey.
Okay. And then to tack onto that, with regards to your youth court, did the juvenile court and the district court also participate?
You're asking with us?
Yes.
No, we haven't directly had them involved. It's a great idea.
Great. Okay, and again, a reminder, we're getting a large number of questions, but if you do have a question, please go ahead and put it in using the dashboard on the right side of your screen. And our next question, oops, sorry, I'm scrolling through all of them. William, can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned that HUD reports some information to you, but they also collect information on a broader level. Can you talk about how, if it's okay for communities to collect broader information as long as they segregate the data that is due to HUD, and then also whether or not HUD is interested in seeing the number of youth being collected on a broader definition, and is there any way to report that information to HUD?
Yeah, great questions. We definitely encourage communities to collect as much data as they feel is feasible. We know that even the amount of data we ask for from the HUD minimum standard, for some areas that's difficult. And so we just ask that as a COC or as you work with your COC, you consider what the limit should be. We've already heard if there are too many questions, it turns youth away. So youth they're actually more sensitive than even other populations about the number of questions. And so we'd encourage you, yes, if you think you can do it, get information beyond our definition, just find ways to clearly kind of demarcate which ones fit the definition, which don't. And so how do you present that data to us, or can you present it to us? That's a great question. Right now we don't actually have an official venue for it. I am happy to receive it and look at it. We always love to see what more is out there, especially as we do budget hearings. We're involved in the Ending Homelessness charge by 2020 for youth in particular. So any information we get, even if we pocket it anecdotally and present it as such, we're happy to do it. We definitely want to make the case that there are youth out there, they need to be served, and the services often expand beyond the literal homeless definition.
Okay, great. Jenny and Lynn, this is a question for the two of you. Since you're compensating youth for participation in the count and you're paying youth to conduct the count as well, can you talk about the funding sources that you're using to be able to pay for that?
Yeah, this is Lynn. Actually, it was Applied Survey Research that provided the funding, and it was part of the contract that they had with our with the City of San Jose and County of Santa Clara to administer the count and to facilitate that whole thing. So they were the ones that actually came up with the funding for that.
In Sonoma County, we've also been working with Applied Survey Research, and the budget involves them. However, I've been on the side of it where we've raised the funds for it, and we have gone to each of the incorporated cities in our county and requested a contribution toward the count as a whole. And part of that contribution, we're very clear that the contribution is for payment to either homeless guides in the general count or the youth conducting the youth count. So there's a very specific funding source that is coming from the cities and the county as the unincorporated county.
Okay, great. Okay, and then William, we got a question which is not actually pertaining to the unsheltered count specifically, but does seem like an important question to answer to clarify. With regards to foster children who may be in a shelter location, but that they're not counted as homeless while in that location, can you talk a little bit about how foster children may be handled if they're in a shelter?
Yeah, tough. That's definitely a tough one. We've always had the stance that if an individual is under the purview of the government, or, well, let's just say the government, generally the government, that they're not considered homeless because they are required by the standards of the government to be housed. Clearly, if they're in a shelter and they're under that standard, we start to define the gray areas. We would say if they're in the shelter, we typically would allow it. If you're aware that they are in the foster care system, and typically it sounds like they would be fleeing in that case, then they would in fact be homeless. So if there's more to that, if there's other scenarios, we'd need to hear more. I'm guessing there's probably, for lack of a better term, way station uses of the shelter where they're under the government provision, but they're awaiting placement and being used or being placed in shelters. If that's possible, or if that's what they're doing, we would say that if they're still under the government's charge, yes, in fact, they probably should not be counted. So it's a gray area. I'd have to see specific facts for the scenario if we get to something there. So you could send a question through, to ask a question if this happens in the count, or if you have something more generic or more specific. You can send a question now, and I'll talk it through with our other youth experts, and that way I won't be too premature in my answer here.
Okay, great. So our next question is, has there been any thought given to actually hosting the count over several days as opposed to only one day in order to reach more youth? And William, I'll let you answer that from a HUD perspective to start with, but then Jenny, I thought that maybe you might like to jump in, seeing as you do your count in 2 separate phases and what that looks like.
Yes, we certainly allow counts over more than a single day. That's kind of one of those myths that's been out there. The catch is you have to be able to deduplicate, which generally involves a survey, and that's the most common way to do it. If there is a community that wants to do a count, for lack of a better term, a blitz count, where they're just counting heads and doing a sampling later to get demographics, we would allow that with a waiver. We know there are some large communities that, just because they are unable to get to the entire community, they do it over 2 days. We have allowed that, and that's without a survey, but it's been rare. Generally, we require that the survey component allows for deduplication.
What I can say is that there's been this thought in our community over many years that if only we could count for over a whole week, we would do a much better job and we'd see almost everybody. And so we did try it one year, and we lost numbers that year. That was actually the year that providers began to seriously question our methodology. I think part of what happens is that the more people know about it, the more people get worried about being tracked, about being found, about some kind of negative consequences to the fact that the count is going on as long as it does. So we've just worked to get the coverage, the physical coverage to do that head count within a 24-hour period, and then immediately with deduplication capacity do our survey. Going for longer never did us any good.
Jenny. Coco, are you aware of any communities in the state of California that may be doing their count over a longer period of time and doing a deduplication?
Yeah, so Southern Nevada, where Michelle Fuller-Hallauer is the COC lead, they conduct their whole count over a little bit more than 24 hours. They go over about 36 to 48 hours. And they have it, it's very, very thoughtful. They're one of those very large COCs, of which there are quite a few in the West. And they start with the urban count in the morning of adults, and then once school starts, start their count of youth, so that they're getting the school numbers from the schools and the kids who are on the streets. And so because they're counting those at the same time, they're comfortable that they're not duplicating there. And then that night, they start their rural count and do an overnight count in the rural areas. And for the youth and minors they run into in the rural areas, they do systematic surveys of all of them so that they can go ahead and get better data. This coming year, I believe they're planning to try to survey all youth in the whole COC. So by spreading it out, they're able to spread out their resources. The Hollywood Homeless Youth Count, which was not a formal PIT, but was an example of a community wanting to do a more inclusive count, did a count over a week, and did have a survey and asked youth if they had been homeless on a particular night, so that they would be reporting numbers regarding homelessness on one day. And so although they counted for a week period, they focused on whether a young person was homeless on that night. Because youth are intermittently, literally homeless, this seems like a great approach. And I think counting on multiple days is really critical. I think duplication is something that there is a lot of concern about, but I would say that given the lack of inclusion of youth, that it's important to think that through so that you can minimize it as much as possible. But I do think that it is an important barrier to youth inclusion, and that while not ignoring it, I think it's very important for communities not to be frozen by the fear of duplication and be able to reach out to youth in an intelligent way so that they can be counted.
Great, thank you, Coco. William, I think that this question is probably directed towards you, but if other speakers have thoughts on the use of social media, feel free to jump in once you send. But one of our participants said that they were thinking about undertaking a social media survey count to increase participation. Is that allowed? And they have a question on the survey that asks if they've already completed a written survey or an interview survey to avoid duplications, and they also ask for initials and month and year of birth as well to help with the deduplication.
That, I have to admit, is the first time I've received the question. We certainly don't envision that right now, just because there are enough issues with the potentiality of duplication with that. We certainly encourage the use of social media. We hadn't thought about it as a means of actually doing counts when you're not in front of a person. We certainly would think of it more as a PR tool or a way to access people. So I'd have to see more on it. I would say my, again, first take on it would be it's not likely because there is so much in seeing them, or at least seeing those in your sample and then using your sample to extrapolate up using valid extrapolation methods. And so it depends if we're talking about using a face-to-face sample and then using social media to back up an extrapolation. So there might be a potentiality for using it, but probably not on its own without other face-to-face interaction.
Okay, great. And Lynn and Coco and Jenny, do either of you ever use or have you seen the use of social media as a tool for recruiting volunteers or as a tool for publicizing the count? And if you have, can you talk a little bit about those efforts?
This is Coco. The way that I've seen, or that I've heard it being used successfully, is to encourage participation at magnet events and let people know about magnet events. And that was done in Seattle and I believe in Nevada as well, off the top of my head. So that's the main way I've seen it done. I think that given that there is a lot of suspicion about counts in the youth community, that using social media to let people know about the count and let people know that it can be trusted and it's a way of giving youth a voice in their community should definitely be encouraged.
This is Jenny. We haven't used social media in recruiting youth. We have it in the general count, used it to recruit volunteers. But it seems that at least at this point where we are with organizing it, that the word of mouth and the personal relationships matter much more.
I would agree. We haven't used it either in our counts.
I would just add, just quickly, there are some very good examples of using social media in Ohio. I think there's a video of that in Cleveland that's available online.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to all of our speakers, William, Coco, Jenny, and Lynn. And to remind everyone, there will be a recording of this webinar available on the National Alliance to End Homelessness's website, hopefully within the next week. We'll also make sure to make available all of the presentations and slides from today's presentations, and we will attempt to make available a lot of the tools that the communities spoke about today, and particularly the ones that Coco talked about as well. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you'll join in future webinars. Have a great day.